Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. China's president has returned from his first visit to Europe in nearly 5 years. Xi Jinping chose the 25th anniversary of NATO's bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, Serbia, to visit. He also visited France, marking 60 years of diplomatic ties, as well as Hungary, celebrating 75 years. On the trip, Xi sought to win support for his vision of a multipolar world and countering American dominance. So, did he succeed? Joining us to discuss this are Marc Cheng, European Union Centre in Taiwan Executive Director, and Mathieu Duchâtel, Institut Montaigne Resident Senior Fellow and Director of International Studies. A very warm welcome to both of you on the show today. Marc, if I could start with you first. So let's discuss why Xi Jinping chose these three destinations.
Of course, for France, it's actually, important day for the bilateral relations between France and China. It's an anniversary date. And of course, Hungary and, Serbia is actually a long-term friend for China to either, counterbalance or is kind of, important, base for the 17+1 for China. So I think it's understandable.
It's 14+1 now, isn't it?
Yeah, right. So the number changes, but it's actually quite important, from the Chinese perspective, a partner or a potential, friends, in the regions to actually enhance Chinese presence in the region.
Mathieu, why now, after 5 years? Ostensibly because of the anniversaries.
Well, the anniversaries matter, even though the 60th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between France and the PRC was quite downplayed in Paris this time. I think Xi picked three countries which each have a kind of divide and rule potential. France, from a Chinese perspective, has this Gaullist tradition of not fully aligning with the United States, even though there is a transatlantic alliance, which is the cornerstone of French foreign policy. Hungary represents, inside the European Union, the EU member state that is the most closely aligned with a non-liberal vision of political systems or societal issues.
And Russia? And aligned with Russia?
And sympathetic with the Russian view on Ukraine, let's put it that way. And Serbia has this history of being bombed by NATO, which connects it to the history of modern China.
Maybe the undercurrents as well as the anniversaries, Marc, is the, wanting to kind of fend off a trade war with the EU.
Yes. Of course, it comes in a very interesting time because actually EU already started some, investigation of China and emphasizing that, it's unfair, competitions in many sectors. And of course, the EU Commission actually taking more firm and strong position on that. That's why Macron also invited von der Leyen to join the meeting. So I would say that...
Ursula von der Leyen.
Yeah, von der Leyen. So I mean that for France, he's actually the leader in the European Union. And Hungary is taking a more kind of interesting place that is actually coming to be, the president of the Council of the European Union in the next few months. Yeah. So I think, from the talk that, you can see that China also look high on Hungary and thinking that probably there is something new with the EU-China relations.
Yeah, so a gateway to the EU. Yes. Now, to Serbia, the second stop of Xi's three-stop trip, a non-NATO, non-EU country, as we've mentioned, that remains close to Russia. The visit came on the anniversary of the US-NATO bombing of the Chinese embassy in 1999, which Xi wrote in an op-ed piece, China should never forget, and we will never allow such a tragic history to repeat itself. On Xi's visit, Serbian President Aleksander Vucic also signed up for his country to become a community with a shared future, the first in Europe to do so, joining Xi's vision of a new world order. Mathieu, let me ask you about Serbia. So was this visit about anti-Western unity?
Well, first thing, I think we should not overestimate the importance of Serbia in Europe. First, in terms of economic weight, the GDP of Serbia is about $80 million US. That's slightly only more than the annual revenue of TSMC, and that would make Serbia the weakest economy in the European Union. If Serbia was in the EU, but Serbia is not. So it does not have the power to move the EU in any direction at all. But Serbia has some symbolic political importance for China. I think Xi's presence in Serbia helped him to underscore two important points from a Chinese perspective. The first point is about NATO. And here, I think that the message that Xi is conveying to his domestic audience, but also the international community, is about the responsibility of NATO, of course, bombing the Chinese embassy, but fast forwarding to today in the Ukraine war. And here I think that China is reinforcing the Russian narrative regarding the root causes of the Ukraine war. So that's a very strong message.
So essentially NATO's expansion and aggression, and that China and Russia are victims of that.
Definitely, yes. And behind that, there is the Chinese narrative that there is a NATOization of the Asia-Pacific going on, so that the US is responsible for trouble in East Asia. And that leads me to the second political message, and that's about Taiwan. In Serbia, Xi Jinping found a political leader who can say publicly not only that Taiwan is part of China, so it's way beyond the one China policy of European countries, it's really the one China principle. Chinese version, but he also basically said that whatever China does to solve the Taiwan issue, Serbia will always support. And I think that's a very strong message, but I do not think that's a message that carries a lot of weight in Europe for one main reason. That's the history of the personal history of the Serbian president, Aleksander Vucic. He used to be the Minister of Information for Milosevic. You know that Milosevic was indicted for war crimes and crimes against humanity.
And then they like to draw the comparison between Kosovo and Taiwan. And
Definitely,
China.
yes.
Right. Marc, so how successful was this leg of the trip then for Xi Jinping, for Aleksander Vucic?
I think you have to define, successive in which way. If it's kind of domestic considerations, probably, she, have a very successful, visit to Europe, to the local audience in China. President Xi is so popular and welcome, and the people shouting China, 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 then welcome Xi, with flags. So I think, from a kind of a visibility, inside the Chinese domestic, politics, I think Xi is successful. But, if you are talking about the impact over, the positive way to the EU-China relation, I think, it's not really a successful trip. Probably, China consolidate, its relations with Hungary, with Serbia, and show China is actually a partner for you. It's not a rival or is not an enemy. So France have to think clear about the relation with China. So I think to some extent, Xi want to have the impact over this kind of propaganda or visibility in Europe.
Mathieu, let's just talk briefly about what Serbia got in return. What was Serbia most excited about in terms of the investment?
Well, obviously there is China is a major partner in terms of investment in Serbian critical infrastructure. A lot is going on. A bridge in Belgrade, a railway towards Budapest, high-speed railway, even though this project has been facing very important delays. China is also investing in the Serbian critical minerals sector. Right. But I think that from a Serbian strategic positioning, China's investment in the Serbian critical infrastructure sector is only one part of the equation. The other part of the equation is that Serbia is also seeking European investment, EU funding for some of its critical infrastructure projects. So it's a classic strategy of seeking benefits from two very important players. It's important for Serbia to have a free trade agreement with China, but I don't think it's a model for the European Union. There's a major difference of scale. If you look at the details, the China-Serbia bilateral trade is slightly above 3 billion euros per year. The China-EU bilateral trade is slightly below 3 billion euros as well, but per day. So, we are speaking of a completely different trade structure, and what Serbia sells to China, if you look at the list of export products, it's mostly minerals or metals, so not manufactured products. So I think there's really a question in the structure of China-Serbia trade, whether this is beneficial to the Serbian industry or if this is not creating or deepening of a model of access only to Serbian raw materials.
Okay. Now, next to Hungary, which is a EU member and probably the thorniest thorn in the side of Brussels for what the EU says is its undermining of EU core values. Budapest is also to assume presidency of the rotating Council of the European Union. Chinese state media calls Hungary the most Western of Eastern nations. Viktor Orban boasted of Xi's visit, cementing their country's bilateral golden relations. Marc, so what was Xi's agenda in visiting Hungary?
As I say, Hungary is actually a long-term friend for China. And, the 14+1, 70+1, One Belt, One Road initiative, Hungary always play important portal for China enter to the CEE area. Then, of course, Hungary usually take different positions in many, European issues, in the opposite side of the Commission.
So it can act as a kind of veto, is it, to act in favor of China?
Because the decision-making process of Brussels is more like you need a consensus among all the member states. So the role of Hungary become more and more important to China that, Hungary can easily help China to at least delay the decisions of Brussels to the sanction or any stronger their behavioral decision toward China.
So the looming trade war that we've spoken about. Mathieu, if we could address the this idea of Hungary being the gateway for China. Let's talk about the economic benefits to China by investing in Hungary.
Yeah, there is a very interesting story regarding the automotive industry. As you know, Hungary has successfully attracted a major investment by BYD to build an electric vehicle automotive plant in Hungary. There was competition from other EU member states, including France, but Hungary won this, partly thanks to good political relations with China, partly thanks to a good offer commercially. But I think this plant is very important politically and strategically currently to China, because what China faces in Europe is a question of keeping access to the EU single market. And China's access to the EU single market was never threatened until now. There are some initiatives going on in the European Union that could have an impact on China's market access.
The anti-dumping.
Indeed, for the automotive sector, the entire subsidy investigation is going on. It's targeting 3 Chinese companies. The European Commission is very likely to come up with a proposition for increased tariffs on imports of Chinese electric vehicles. Currently, the European tariffs are at 10%. We hear that the US is probably going to come with a 100% tariff in the coming weeks or months. This is happening in the United States. But the longer game is how this will evolve and whether the European Union will become more defensive. So not only about tariffs against Chinese state subsidies to the automotive sector, but also supporting the European car industry through industrial policy means. There are different policy tools that can be used. But I think that China is facing the prospect of much stronger defensive moves by the European Union, and that's why investing in plants
in Hungary
makes a lot of sense.
Could they essentially put tariffs on Chinese cars coming through Hungary into the rest of the EU? Marc?
Unfortunately, it's no. It's that if
it would be tariff-free because Hungary is part of the EU.
It's a single market.
Right. Now, Xi's first leg was to France to visit Emmanuel Macron, whose goal is strategic autonomy for the EU. Following his own visit to Beijing in April last year, Macron said there was a danger the EU could become a vassal to the US if it did not build up strategic autonomy. Nor should the EU get caught up in crises that are not ours. When referring to Taiwan, Macron said. The French president was criticised for these comments not only by American and EU lawmakers, but within his own country. Despite the EU's stated intent to de-risk from China, Macron has made it clear he wishes to deepen economic and political ties with China. Mathieu, if I could come to you. Let's compare the visit to France with the Eastern European visits.
Well, I think that this time French diplomacy really worked very hard to prevent the impression that Chinese diplomacy was using this trip to divide the European Union or to divide the US and the EU over a range of issues. And how did French diplomacy do that? There was a lot of coordination with other countries prior to the trip. The Japanese Prime Minister was hosted by the French President 3 days before Xi Jinping. Kurt Campbell, the Undersecretary of State, was also hosted in French for coordination with the US prior to the trip. There was an encounter between the French president and the representative of the Tibetan government in exile for the first time. I think there were a lot of signals from the French side that France is part of the Western alliance and that this doesn't change. And then I think if you compare to the visits to Serbia and Hungary, what is also remarkably different is the emphasis on the European Union. The invitation to European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen to join Emmanuel Macron really underscored what were the two priorities from a French perspective. One, China's support for Russia. That was actually the top priority on French list. And secondly, all the trade and investment issues, questions of asymmetry, question of imbalances. And I think that this time, this trip struck a very different note to the state visit by the French president last year to China.
Did Macron succeed in those goals that Mathieu has outlined?
I think if you look at the media coverage, you will find that there is no significant a breakthrough between France and China or even EU-China relations. All we see is actually more like Macron invited Xi go to his second hometown to have a good photos that Chinese government say that it's really a long-term friendship inside the mountains, something like that. So I think there's no much we can see the breakthrough or a kind of consensus between the France and China for the coming crisis or the continued crisis between Europe and also Russia. So
he also denied that there was any overcapacity from the Chinese makers of solar panels, EVs, which so essentially denying that there is a problem.
Right. I think it's a kind of a long-existing problem between China and the European countries. France just want to point it out. At the same time, urge China to invest more in France because it's actually not European scope. It's actually investment is actually based on the member states. So member states try to have a more FDI into their own territory. So I think France is making very clear that the foreign direct investment is also what France needed, but must be under the EU framework. So I think at the same time, there's a lot of expectation from outside to this kind of summit meeting, but definitely there's no very concrete, result for both sides.
Okay. Serbian leader Vucic's declaration, the sky's the limit between his country and China, had echoes of the no-limits partnership between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. Russian Prime Minister Putin is expected to visit China this week for a meeting with Xi Jinping following the Russian president's re-election to his fifth term. Mathieu, as you outlined, Macron's top goal was about asking Xi to use his influence against Putin, to stop supporting Russia's economy, and also to ask Russia to essentially help stop the war.
I think on the French side, I don't think there was naivety in the sense that there was no ambition to drive a wedge between China and Russia. I think the way it was framed was more that in recent months, there has been a lot of new evidence that China's support for Russia has actually increased in the context of Russian advances in Ukraine territory. So I think the French goal was to frame it more modestly, to stop this trend towards acceleration and not to stop it, because that would not be realistic. This is not going to stop. There were some verbal commitments by Xi Jinping not to sell weapons to Russia. I think it doesn't go to the bottom of the problem, which is transfers of Chinese dual-use technology equipment to the Russian arms industry. I think the French diplomacy was part of a concerted Western diplomacy towards China to put increased pressure on those Chinese entities that actually sell equipment to the Russian arms industry. It's very difficult to stop that because it goes under the radar screen. There's no way to actually trace very precisely those elements of support.
But was there any evidence that she is actually interested in trying to?
I think Xi was obviously interested in changing the perception in Europe that China's actions actually have a destabilizing effect on the European security order. But here we have to go back to Serbia and Hungary. Xi didn't pick Poland, he didn't pick the Baltic states, he didn't pick the states in Eastern Europe that have completely changed their perception of China as a result of the deepening China-Russia strategic partnership. So he didn't seek to assuage their concerns. On the contrary, I think that his choice of Serbia and Hungary have actually increased the sense in those countries that China is working against European security.
And fully in support of Russia. Now, in 2012, Beijing set up the 17+1 mechanism as a means to promote business and investment between China and Central and Eastern Europe. Lithuania was the first to quit in 2021, followed by Latvia and Estonia in 2022, citing unfulfilled expectations. The invasion of Ukraine has forced the remaining countries to rethink their relations with China. So, Marc, can we see evidence that perhaps China is trying to, pit the East against the West, again, more or less like the Cold War?
I think, the purpose of China, in visited Europe is to try to have Europe at least not stand firmly with the United States in this new core division. So I think, there's no much choice for the Xi from Europe. So I think, France is kind of autonomy, strategic autonomy, right? It's a kind of always like, the conduct, the greatness of the foreign policies of France. Is the country who can actually get some support for Chinese positions. Germany also a good partner because they have so deeply interdependence on trade. But apart these two, that the Hungary, the Serbia is actually probably the only two possible, friends who can create kind of, as I say, a perception that Europe is welcome, and need China in some extent. But apart from these four countries, you probably don't find many friends can really, stand with China. I think unless the end of the Russia-Ukraine war, most of the European countries cannot and would not, stand with China or even improve the relation with China because China already choose their side.
Okay, Mathieu, final question. So if Xi Jinping was to be realistic about his goals in Europe, do you think he would assess that he was successful?
I think China's goal towards Europe is framed in a negative way, not in a positive way. China wants to avoid an overly defensive Europe aligned with the United States, not only on trade, investment, and technology issues, but also on international security issues. I think the sad reality is that Europe is not fully united on those goals within the European Union, But I would say that especially the French leg of the trip showed a trend towards going back to a cohesive Europe, especially with regards to what we call now the economic security agenda.
So a cohesive Europe apart from the outliers of countries like Serbia and Hungary. Is that what you're saying?
Well, Serbia is not part of the EU, but Hungary, in fact, is not blocking those EU initiatives. Hungary is playing its own game, but it's not part of the countries that really block the European agenda on those issues. Hungary usually ends up by playing along.
Right. Okay, we'll have to end it there. Thank you so much, Marc Cheng and Mathieu Duchâtel, for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today.
We bring you stories from Taiwan.
Every day of the week.
Our reporters travel the nation.
Exploring the issues that matter to you.
News from here in Taiwan and around the world.
What's up, Taiwan? On Taiwan Plus.
At Connected, we believe in the power of dialogue.
Taipei 101 station.
It's not just about the headlines, it's about finding common ground. Join the conversation.
Connected with Divya Gopalan on Taiwan Plus.